Good morning. I'm here today to announce the Assembly's budget blueprint, to just go through a couple major issues that we'll be looking at over the next few months through the Assembly Budget Subcommittee process and our entire process as we work with the Senate as well as with the Governor's office. I think what was interesting in looking retrospectively in November is that California voters again gave the legislature and the governor's office a very strong mandate. We have 2/3 supermajorities again for the second time in 4 years in the legislature in Sacramento. Voters overwhelmingly supported candidates and our policies and really our overall vision of the state. Secondly, voters again for the second time in those 4 years also decided to increase taxes, something that was rather historic 4 years ago. They renewed Prop 30 via Prop 55, the income tax portion of it. They passed a tobacco tax. They also, again, really enshrined our MCO tax into law. So voters are starting to pay attention and really understand the link between revenue and expenses. I think the 2008 recession was historic in the sense that it was one of the first times, at least in recent history, that voters and constituents really started to feel the impact of budget cuts, whether it's in education, health care, transportation, really a variety of areas. The big unknown, again, that's really been looked at over the next few months is what will come from Washington, D.C. And frankly, as part of our budget process, we can't plan for what will happen from Washington, D.C. We can't really predict what will happen. So we're going to continue to do a budget that forwards our values, our vision, with a firm focus on education, on healthcare, on ensuring a better quality of life for all Californians, and making sure that we continue that process. I know that there have been concerns about impending doom and catastrophe. Well, I don't change my commute over the Golden Gate Bridge, over the Bay Bridge in anticipation of the next earthquake. I don't think we should change our budget process in anticipation of what may come from Washington. So we will go ahead and plan a status quo budget, assuming status quo from Washington until we know otherwise. And I think to do anything different would be irresponsible and frankly reckless at this point. So I think it's much more prudent to continue to do what Californians sent us back here to do, which is to do our jobs, to continue to support education and healthcare and a variety of services, and look at those particular areas. As you know, we spent most of our years in deficits. Really, the last few years, we've been able to start to climb out of that and actually have a long-term structural budget surplus. In fact, the LAO recently announced that the budget surplus now is about $1.5 billion, $1.25 billion to $2 billion right now. We are projecting reserves of potentially up to $15 billion. And again, these reserves are, we have not projected a recession into this budget surplus or into these reserves. So obviously, if we were to have a recession during this period of time, then we would not have the $15 billion of reserve. The whole point of the reserve would be to be able to stall any potential cuts and to use those reserves to backfill potential cuts into any of the programs that we think are absolutely critical. So again, and the $15 billion reserve is also with an assumption that we will be spending $1 billion more a year. So over that same period of time, as we're saving money to historic reserves, we're also planning some additional spending. Again, the three big unknowns that we think may have significant impacts from the federal government are three areas. One is on immigration policy and really how it affects potential or tying funding to any immigration policy changes. Additionally, changes to the Affordable Care Act would have significant impacts, and climate change policies would obviously have significant impacts. Just to give you a sense of what's at stake, with the Affordable Care Act, we were able to bring over 5 million Californians into health insurance. About 3.8 million were covered by Medicaid expansion, and another 1.2 were covered by Covered California. So if the policy was to completely go away, 5 million Californians would be going without health care like they were before. We obviously think that would be grossly irresponsible. We think that the 5 million Californians are much better under the current system and to have health care rather than for them to go back to the past, which is going into the emergency rooms, spending huge amounts of dollars at the county level, or frankly not going in to get any medical care, and frankly showing up to work or not showing up to work, huge economic losses across the board. I want to just kind of walk you through a couple areas that we will be focused on looking in terms of potential enhancements. One, we obviously have an amazing economy here in California. We fluctuate between the 5th or the 6th largest economy, depending on the mood of Great Britain. We are very proud of what we've been doing in creating this very robust innovation economy that has been the envy of the entire world. Yet we know large parts of the state continue to struggle. Huge amounts of unemployment. They're in industries that haven't seen significant growth, and they at times feel somewhat left behind by the rest of us. So we also want to make sure that we're doing everything we can as folks are struggling with unemployment or they're transitioning out of old line economies, that we do everything possible to, one, get them jobs or to help them transition into jobs. So we'll be looking at a variety of programs, policies, in ways that we can enhance that area. And what I'm primarily talking about, again, is the inland part of the state, whether it's the rural part of the state, agricultural part of the state, or even in the part of the state that is heavily dependent on oil. As we are moving into a greener economy, or as the agricultural economy sort of stagnates, we want to make sure that we're also taking care of all those communities as well. Number two, we'll be looking at different opportunities to expand the earned income tax credit. We think this is one of the most effective tools and the easiest tools to alleviate poverty. It's one way that we can instantly and quickly put money back in the hands of folks who make under $13,000 a year, which is, frankly, in California, next to nothing. And it's something that we can employ as a tool and really deploy very, very quickly. Third, we'll be looking at steps to move toward full-day kindergarten. We've talked about universal preschool. While that remains still a very high goal, we also notice at the same time that under 50% of schools in California don't have all-day kindergarten. So at the same time that we continue to have universal preschool as a goal, we will also be looking at ways that we can ensure that every child who's in kindergarten gets a full day. Schools actually get funded for full-day kindergarten, so I think what we need to do is really create some incentives so that all districts really move toward that, and as well as those districts that have facilities issues. What we've heard of, one of the major issues is around facilities. Maybe we can find ways to incentivize them to move toward really building those facilities. And just to give you just a rough example, so in Sacramento Unified, schools are allowed to actually choose whether or not to do full-day kindergarten. So the irony is schools that have space actually end up moving towards full-day kindergarten because they have room, versus schools that tend to be a little more popular, they're the ones that actually don't have full-day kindergarten. So for example, many schools in Sacramento actually go 8:30 to 11:30 or 9 to 12. My daughters in San Francisco Unified, their kindergarten is the same as every other class. They go from 8:40 to 2:40, so a full day. So we'll be really looking at different incentives that we can do to understand and how to help school districts move toward that. Fourth, we're going to be looking at a long-term program framework to phase in debt-free college education. This is something that obviously numerous presidential candidates talked about. We've really increased our funding for Cal Grants, but also middle-class scholarships, but we'll be looking at long-term tools to continue to enhance that and to make sure that as many people as possible can graduate from college debt-free. And lastly is to really look at funding for housing and homelessness. That's a major problem for most of the state. We continue to have a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis. LA has, I believe, tens of thousands of people in homelessness. We have in San Francisco about 7,000 people in homelessness, and it seems to be getting worse every single day. So these are things that we know that the state traditionally has not played in, but we'll be looking at both revenue options as well as funding options to really work and enhance our housing and homelessness programs. And just to give you a sense of some of the direction we'll be going, the low-income housing tax credit has been, a major tool for nonprofit developers and for developers to really build affordable housing. The MHP program, which has been universally regarded as very effective, has not been funded of late. So those are two areas that we'll be looking at. We're able to make some progress last year in funding some of the homelessness programs, but we know that we need to streamline the ability of cities to build homeless shelters, but also to really try to increase funding for programs that stop people from becoming homeless. The good news from California's fiscal point of view, we haven't been this fiscally healthy in quite a long time. And it's really because of the tough decisions the governor, the legislature, but really the voters made. The voters have worked with us to enhance revenue. At the same time, we've been very responsible to not overspend, but also to spend and be very, very careful as to long-term spending. Last year, we worked with the governor to do some one-time enhancements, but really try to keep the long-term spending to a minimum, frankly, just in making sure that we remain in good fiscal health. We also wanted to make sure that going into this budget year, again, we have a couple major priorities. One is maintaining that fiscal health, having strong reserves, also trying to make sure we're trying to isolate ourselves as much as possible from whatever federal harm may be done, and also making sure that we are trying to do what we can to make sure that we're alleviating poverty, but also trying to bring in those families that have been left behind. If you look at the budget, a budget is a reflection of our values. It's an absolute reflection of our values. If you look at what our budget is, 60% of it is education. Health and Human Services is another huge chunk of it.